Welcome back to General Biology at Rogers State University. Again, Dr. Keith Martin. We're entering like the last month here of class of our semester. You guys are doing great, and the exam was last week. Overall scores were very good, very strong on the exam. So hey, things happen really fast here in April, and the month is going to go by really fast. Really, about 4 weeks of class here, 4 weeks of instruction, and then we'll have a final exam at the very end, and the last few days of April will be the last chapter, and then the very first week of May will be the final exam. So let's start with some general ecology. This is the some of the later chapters in the text, beginning with chapter 37. That's what we're going to talk about this week. Just populations, and this is going to be our general ecology section of the semester. So let's jump right in. I'm an ecologist. This is kind of the things I do. This is what I do even in retirement. I'm still an ecologist. I'm a bat ecologist or a cave ecologist. I spent a lot of time in caves in eastern Oklahoma, and I still do. I'll be in caves this summer studying bats, bat ecology. So this is a part of the chapter that I'm most familiar with and still most involved with. Ecology is the study of relationships among organisms and their environment. So that's what an ecologist does. They study relationships between specific organisms, caribou in this case, and you can see the distribution here of where these are found. And this is what ecologists do. They study organisms and how they interact with their relationships, with their environments. Environmentalists are a little different. An environmentalist is more concerned about climate and how climate and humans especially interact, as opposed to an ecologist. And so let's spend these last several chapters talking about ecology. Now remember, in early on in the semester, we had uh, we had levels or hierarchy of organization. Remember, we said that cells are the most basic unit of life, but very few organisms exist as a single cell. Most organisms clump cells together, similar cells together, to form tissues. Tissues then are grouped together to form organs. Organs are grouped together to form organ systems, like the cardiovascular system or the digestive system or the reproductive system. And then organ systems oftentimes will comprise higher organisms. Those were levels of organization. Well, in ecology, we have similar levels of hierarchy or levels of organization, the smallest of which is a population. A population is all the same interbreeding organism living in a specific area. Think of a pond or a lake in eastern Oklahoma. All of the smallmouth bass in a stream in the Illinois River or the Barren Fork River or the Spavinaw Creek. Well, all of the smallmouth bass represent a population of smallmouth bass. Um, Largemouth bass in Ulagal Lake or Grand Lake, all of the largemouth bass comprise a population of largemouth bass in a certain area. Well, bass don't just isolate themselves, they are supported by a broader or higher complex group called a community. These are all of the populations representing multiple species. Um, Feed fish, forage fish, uh, predators, prey. That's a community. And then even broader is an ecosystem. An ecosystem is all of the living and non-living aspects of an environment that interact with each other. Chemical flow, water flow, other organisms. That's an ecosystem. And then the largest level of ecology is the biosphere. It's the layer around the earth, that thin layer where life can exist or that can support life, what we call the biosphere. So multiple levels of hierarchy in ecology, just like we did in other areas of biology. You hear the term habitat a lot, and if we had to define what habitat is, it's the physical location where a population lives. This is a desert habitat here. I'm looking out my window here in western Colorado, and it's a desert habitat. It's bare ground. There's not enough moisture, maybe 8 inches of rain a year that supports life, and so that's habitat. Where we live in eastern Oklahoma, it's a different kind of habitat. And now population density is how dense the population is, the number of individuals in a population in a localized area. It's how many individuals are there in eastern Oklahoma, especially out in the county a little bit. We can study the population density of oak trees, red oaks, in a particular area, or redbuds that are blooming right now, or dogwoods that are blooming right now. The density in a certain area, that's a population density. So this is what we're talking about in this chapter, our populations. Groups of organisms of the same species living in a specific area. Now, I try not to humanize this too much because we don't want to just talk about humans here. In ecology, humans just make up a part of the biosphere. So let's try not to humanize it, and let's try to think of other populations. So let's try not to make it just animalistic either. Plant populations, fungal populations. Let's think broader than that as we walk through this. Well, populations are distributed around the world or in habitats really in three different ways. They are distributed uniformly, and uniform distribution are like the penguins here on the right side of the slide. Emperor penguins tend to have a kind of a small territory, but they do have a territory, and they kind of repel each other. And so they lay their eggs, and then they occupy a kind of a pretty uniform distribution in a certain area. Some are randomly distributed, like the top here. These are you've been out hiking and biking. You've seen these lichens on sandstone rocks or limestone rocks, and you see these. They're very common. They're a combination of algae and fungus that live on hard surfaces, and they kind of be randomly distributed. There's nothing pushing them away or attracting them. They're just kind of randomly distributed. But most organisms are clumped, like at the bottom here, some palmetto trees. Most organisms are distributed in clumps. Now, I need you to think about why. Organisms need a lot of environmental factors to live: water, air, soil, temperatures, different kinds of chemicals, different type of environmental conditions. And environmental conditions are not distributed randomly or uniformly across the globe. They're in clumps. Some habitats are so desert that they just simply don't support large populations of animals, organisms. So resources are not uniformly distributed across the globe. They're clumped, and we study this in ecology. Highest populations of birds, plants, animals, insects are in the tropical regions. And as we move away from the equator north and south, those populations become less, and less. So they're not uniformly distributed across the globe. Populations are normally clumped in their distribution across the globe. And organisms are also separated oftentimes. Populations are oftentimes separated. They're separated geographically by geological features, water features, mountainous features, habitats, harsh habitats. So we have populations that tend to be disjunct or separated from each other. We call these subpopulations. Oftentimes, black bears populations can be separated into subpopulations. Oftentimes, man-made features will separate populations, like large four-lane highways or Even bigger 6-lane highways will separate populations from each other. Some ecologists are worried that the border wall will create some subpopulations of animals. Birds and bats don't matter because they can fly, but other organisms, a large man-made structure can separate populations. The Great Wall of China, no doubt, established some subpopulations of animals because they couldn't interbreed anymore. We think I-40 that crosses the state of Arkansas kind of separates black bear populations somewhat, north and south. And so those are what we call subpopulations that become separated. Usually natural geographic features do that. Some other things we study in populations are population growth, population size, what impacts population size or population growth, and birth rates and death rates. This is how we estimate populations. Those of you that have husbands that are hunters, or those of you that may be hunters, you know that every year hunted populations are regulated by the Fish and Wildlife Service or the State Department of Wildlife, and every year they determine how many organisms can be taken from the population. Ducks, geese, they determine how many you can harvest. Deer, how many you can harvest. Do you know this, that generally in a hunting season for deer in Oklahoma, about 100,000 animals are harvested every year? Just think about if hunters were not harvesting deer, 100,000 deer every year. If you've ever hit a deer or been hit by a deer in an automobile, you understand what I'm talking about. So how do they establish those regulations? How do they establish what we call bag limits? How many can you harvest? Well, so ecologists have to be very good at predicting birth rates, death rates, and population sizes and population growth. This is a lot of what ecologists do. And in populations, we need to know, what's affecting birth rates, what's affecting death rates, and we have a lot of things that we can talk about here that affect both. Birth rates is the number of individuals that can be produced in a certain period of time or during a population cycle. Immigration is movement of individuals into a population. Immigration with an I. That's and organisms move a lot. Some you hear on TV sometimes and on the news of a mountain lion that might have been found in North Tulsa or in Rogers County. Well, mountain lions are highly transient. They move hundreds and hundreds of miles in one particular season. One black bear that was tagged and radio collared in southeastern Oklahoma literally moved to northern Arkansas, almost Missouri, and then back about 400 miles within one breeding season. So that's immigration is movement of individuals into a population. Well, that's an increase, population increase. So all of these factors here increase birth rates. Well, death rate is the number of deaths per individual per unit time. And sometimes populations can be impacted by what we call immigration with an E, which is the movement of individuals out of a population. A lot of things cause this. Aggression between males within a population, sometimes aggression between females, but mostly aggression between males can force immigration out of a population. And death rate, of course, is just the number of deaths in a population. We also have to talk about what we call age structures. Now, this is, not to knock on insurance agents or insurance companies, but the largest industry in the world is the insurance industry. And insurance companies, they have a lot of algorithms and computer programs that estimate age structures, birth rates, death rates. These things are impacted by where you live, how far you drive, the health of your family, the health of the population in your area, the poverty rate in your area. in other words, insurance companies are not in the business to lose money. So they generate age structures, life and death tables, because they have to. They know what a white male 65 years of age living in a certain area, what the life expectancy is, and therefore their rates of charging insurance, health insurance, life insurance are based on age structures. And so this is not just an ecology thing, but even in humans, one of the largest industries in the world is age structure. How many males at what age in a population? How many females at what age in a population? It's what we call an age structure. So what we do in ecology, and what insurance companies do too, is they develop what we call survivorship curves. Once a cohort of organisms are born, how many are going to survive in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? You get the point. These are what we call survivorship curves. How many are going to be alive in 17 years? It's different for every organism. We're talking animals here mostly, but you can already know what the survivorship curves are for some organisms compared to other organisms. And so it simply shows the proportion of individuals surviving at the next age point. These are what we call survivorship curves. Great graph right here showing a survivorship curve. How many are going to survive in about 17 years? What percent is going to survive over time? And there are really generally three different types of survivorship curves. And look at the size of the animal involved here. Normally, large organisms with long reproductive cycles tend to have what we call a type 1 survivorship curve. And then there's a type 2 and a type 3. So let's talk about each one. Here's type 1 survivorship. Notice there's an elephant here, one of the largest gestation periods of all organisms, very large. Most large vertebrates or mammals tend to fall into this category. They have high survivorship early, and then of course they have long lifespans, and they tend to die towards the end of those lifespans. For an elephant, about 70 years. Bats, surprisingly, are very small, but they have a type 1 survivorship curve. Many bats can live 12, 18, 20 years. The record is about 29 years for an organism that weighs about 14 grams. They're the exception to the type 1 survivorship curve. Normally, they are large organisms, produce not as many young, but they tend to survive longer periods of time. Type 2 survivorship curves, birds tend to fall into this category, where they tend to have the death rate of a population is rather uniform over time, approximately equal probability of dying at any particular age. Birds tend to fall in that category. But a lot of organisms have type 3 survivorship curves where they have a high amount of mortality or death very early on, but those that survive tend to survive relatively long life cycles. They have a high death rate early and lose a lot of offspring. Most of our amphibians, fish, insects tend to fall into this category. In what we call invertebrates, they don't have a backbone or vertebral column. They tend to fall into the type 3 survivorship curve. Well, ecologists, we talk about growth a lot, population growth. If we could define what population growth is, G is population growth here. Population growth is R times N. R is the per capita rate of increase. It's how many organisms one female can produce in a certain reproductive cycle. Now think about this. Some organisms have a pretty low intrinsic rate of increase. Type 1 survivorship curve. Large animals, humans, they tend to have a pretty low intrinsic rate of increase. Whereas other organisms that tend to be small can produce literally thousands of offspring in a single reproductive cycle. That's a very high intrinsic rate of increase. Well, R is the rate of increase per female. And so it's intrinsic, it's built into their physiology. Whereas N is the population size at any particular time. And so R times N is the growth rate in a particular life cycle. We'll give you some examples here. There's first what we call exponential growth. If we have a single E. coli cell in a petri dish, about every 20 minutes, E. coli will divide into 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 16 cells, 32 cells, 64 cells. About every 20 minutes. That's what we call exponential growth with a J-shaped curve. And eventually it will cover that petri dish in a matter of 48 hours. That's what we call exponential growth. It's here, this is a natural population of seals that have been observed over a period of time and over 40 years. And this is an exponential rate of growth. I believe this is probably on an island, maybe not a lot of predators. And so they grow exponentially, starting in about 1960 and all the way to about looks like 1993, 95. Look how much that increased over time. That's what we call exponential growth. It's a J-shaped growth curve. Usually, we know that something is going to happen to this population at some point where it's going to flatten it out a little bit. But this is what we call exponential growth. Organisms grown in a petri dish will grow exponentially. The population growth of humans on the earth in the last 300 years, 200 years, has been exponential growth, unchecked growth. But we know, we can predict this, that there are some things that press against that population growth. There's a ceiling. E. coli in a petri dish, they can only go so far growth-wise. There's only so many resources that they can consume. So there's something that will push back against that exponential growth. And we know this as right here, C, it's called carrying capacity. And that we know that there's going to be something here, environmental resources, nesting space, food, number of mates to mate with, water, denning sites to raise your young. Something is going to press against that exponential growth so that it simply is not going to continue to grow exponentially. And we call that the carrying capacity, or K. And that's the number of individuals that a particular area can support. And so there's what we call environmental resistance against exponential growth. Something is going to push against it. The birth rates might begin to decline, death rates might begin to increase, predation may begin to occur, disease may begin to occur. So a lot of things will environmentally push back against that exponential growth. And we call this logistic growth, not exponential growth. This is logistic growth. Something is going to push against that exponential growth and create a flattening of the population growth here. So this is what we call logistic growth. And this is the growth rate equation for logistic growth. So here's growth, the intrinsic rate of increase per female or per organism. Here's the population size, N. And then in logistic growth, we add this equation here. It's the carrying capacity minus the current population, N, divided by the carrying capacity. This creates a fraction, usually a decimal, less than 1, and it's a proportion or a percentage. It's the carrying capacity minus the population size divided by the carrying capacity. Now look at this. If the carrying capacity of the environment is 1,000 and there's 500 individuals, divided by 1,000, this is going to be 0.5. So you see how it dampens this exponential growth. And that's what we call the carrying capacity equation. That is what we use to estimate population growth. And again, those of you that hunt or have family members that hunt, normally we like our growth to be, or we like our population size here to be about one half the carrying capacity. That's a pretty good growth equation in ecology or wildlife ecology. There are several factors that determine how fast things can grow, how fast population can grow. Some factors are what we call density dependent factors that limit population growth. In other words, the part of that carrying capacity that pushes against growth. Density dependent, we can explain it this way, that the growth of the population is dependent on the density of the population. The more dense the population, the slower the growth. It begins to dampen the growth. The more dense the population gets, the population tends to slow. These are factors that, as the population grows, they push back against the growth. Some of these factors might be competition. The more dense the population, the greater the competition. Competition between males, competition between females for food resources, nutrients, space, food. All of these are factors that will press, as the population gets more and more dense, they compress the growth or the birth rate, may increase the death rate. These are what we call density dependent factors. And predation by other organisms may increase as well. These are what we call density dependent factors. Well, some populations grow independent of what the environmental conditions are. And so there are populations that grow exponentially. Most of these are hooved animals, reindeer, caribou, deer, elk. They tend to grow exponentially regardless of how dense the population is. So density doesn't slow the growth. These are what we call density independent factors. And these populations tend to grow and then bust, grow and then bust. Rodent populations tend to fall into this category. Rabbits and all of our mice and rats tend to fall into this category. Instead, what tends to regulate these populations are catastrophic events: fire, flood, depletion of resources, disease. These are density independent factors that tend to regulate these populations. So we have booms and busts, booms and busts. So density dependent populations and then density independent populations. Then we'll also, in ecology, we often talk about life histories, all of the events that in an organism's life that it experiences over time in what we call life histories. Some are opportunistic, they tend to be kind of short-lived. Weeds, insects, small organisms, type 3 survivorship curves tend to be opportunistic life histories. But some equilibrium life histories tend to be larger organisms that tend to be long-lived, mature kind of late in life, and to reach sexual maturity. So opportunistic versus what we call equilibrium life histories. We have to talk a little bit about this. We have to in ecology. I said we wouldn't humanize this and wouldn't talk about humans much, but we have to talk about the human population growth. In the last 200 years, it has been an exponential population growth. It's grown exponentially, and how large will it get? We're at about what? Seven? Well, I think we're actually at about 9 billion now humans on the earth. Most ecologists believe that the human population will kind of cap out at about 12 million. Do we have a carrying capacity on the earth? Does the earth have a carrying capacity of humans? And so we have to talk about these kinds of things. Whatever your stance is, conservative or liberal, on the talk about climate change. I mean, we have to talk about it. We can't just bury our heads in the sand and talk about it. Those of us in the United States, we're going to be kind of sheltered from the impacts of global climate change, but poorer, more densely populated countries will not. They will struggle in the next 50 years, and that will ultimately impact us. So we have to talk about climate change and the impact of the human growth, exponential growth of humans on the planet. Um, Here's some examples here. Look at the shaded portion to the right. Um, Scientists look at a lot of different factors, how to project human population growth. Um, there are some countries in the world right now that are unable to check their population growth. China has done a very good, I'm sorry, they've done an effective job at not very socially acceptable, but or politically acceptable, but they have curbed their population growth. Other countries have not. India, Pakistan, Somalia, East Africa, there, Bangladesh, some of the probably Indonesian countries are ripe for ecological disaster with their population, unchecked population growth. The populations in Mumbai, India, are off the charts. Slums, development of a million people large in Mumbai. So you and I are rather sheltered from this, but we have to talk about human population growth. This is a pretty incredible couple of graphs I'm getting ready to show you, factors that contribute to human population growth. Most of it is from underdeveloped uh, countries, low to middle income countries. Look at the shaded area. Look at the heavily shaded area. That's much of the population growth in high income countries. And you can see they contribute nominally to the human population growth. So you see what's happening here. And the impacts that this has on ecology is extreme, and especially in the next 20 years, in your lifetime, probably not mine, but in your lifetime, this is going to become an issue in the next 20 to 50 years, especially with global climate change in effect as well. Again, you and I will be rather sheltered from it, but other countries' ecological and social disasters are looming in the next 20 to 30 years as population growth grows. This is an incredible a couple of graphs here. The top graph is the total ecological footprint, the footprint on ecology that each country contributes, with the darker red being the largest global footprint. Uh, the United States and China, India, Brazil, some of the highest ecological footprint globally. In other words, our human growth population is impacting the climate or impacting the world higher because of these countries. You and I live in a country that probably has the highest ecological impact globally. Look at the bottom, the blue. This is the ecological footprint per capita, per person, per you and I. You hear this sometimes called the carbon footprint per capita. It's how much of a global impact you have as an individual. And again, United States, Canada, look at this, Mongolia, very high. Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, very high as well. So not only are we totally impacting, we have a large footprint in the United States, but you and I individually, relatively speaking, have a larger ecological footprint as well across the globe.